life has proximal meanings, right? There's the meaning that you experience when you're engaged in a piece of art, or when you're reading, or when you're engrossed in a movie or in a conversation. There's the meaning that emerges within your relationships with people that you cherish or are enthusiastic with. There's meanings of security and predictability. There's meanings of duty and responsibility and active engagement with your job and your career. There's meanings of aesthetic pleasure. Now, all of those have their value, and each of them has their place. And maybe there's a hierarchy of value there as well, so that some of those meanings are deeper than others. And then you might say, well, what characterized the deepest of all meanings? And it would be something like relationship with the transcendent, and that would establish a relationship between you and what's always been conceptualized as God, which is generally supposed to be something ineffable, right? It's not definable, but you might think about it as the central animating spirit of the age, or the value around which all other values are organized, or the wisdom of the ages, or the creative spirit that possesses you when you're inspired, or what grips you with enthusiasm at a sports event or at a musical event. All of those things. And we need a relationship with that. And we find our deepest meaning in that relationship. And if we don't find it, I think if we don't find it in something that's explicitly religious, then we tend to magnify something of lesser value, say something political, into that to fill the void. So yes, life has proximal meanings without God, without eternity, but at the ultimate level, something's lacking. And it's the desire to fulfill that lack that, and maybe the lack itself, that's part and parcel of the religious instinct. So you can kill God, but you can't. That doesn't rectify the hunger for God. And then that hunger seeks out replacements. That's how it looks to me. So, and then, you might also say, well, does that mean you have to believe in God? And I don't think of the proper answer to that is that you need to agree with a propositional statement. Does God exist? Yes. Like, is this table there? Yes. It's not that kind of relationship. I mean, it's characterized in the Old Testament as a struggle. So Israel means those who struggle with God. And you have to participate in that struggle. And you can do that, weirdly enough, as a believer or as a non-believer. Maybe sometimes more intensely as a non-believer. The issue might be more paramount then, the issue of virtue and the issue of the ultimate orientation. If you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So it's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life. This is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's just bloody endurance. It's like you get up and you work through the next hour, you try to stay on track, you try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability, and you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You'll get through it, and that the darkness will recede, and you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got.
Something like a general theory of meaning. That's really what I've been working on, I would say, for 35 years, something like a general theory of meaning. And so I'm going to see if I can deliver the whole damn thing in 35 minutes, which I've never really been able to manage, but I've had a lot of practice, so maybe this is the night. Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you about is a little bit about how you perceive things, because it's very important to know how you perceive things. And you don't perceive very much, by the way, because, well, there's a lot of the world, way more than you can possibly imagine, and there's not that much of you. And so a lot of information is coming in through a very narrow channel. And it isn't easy, given the fact that all that information exists, it isn't easy to figure out how to narrow that channel so that the information you get is the information that you need. It's information you need that also gives you a grip on the world, right? It has to be practically useful, true and practically useful, something like that. It's a very, 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 very difficult problem to solve. And a lot of it you don't even really solve, because you can't. It's too complicated. You solve it by doing what you're doing right now, for example. So here you are in this unbelievably beautiful building, and I read today a little bit about it, and today it would cost about $1 billion to build this building. And so you're sitting here, and you're all sitting here peacefully, and you're all pointing in the same direction, right? And we're all basically doing the same thing, and we're doing it peacefully, and we can all focus on the same thing, and we had to invest $1 billion for that to be able to happen. And so you think about that, is that part of the way your society solved the problem of the complexity of the world for you was by investing $1 billion in what, how long did it take to construct this place? 15 years, something like that. Maybe it was longer. So that you could sit here in relative comfort and peace and tranquility and concentrate on something that's very focused, maybe something of beauty, something of artistic merit, something of intellectual merit, and that the rest of the world wasn't there, so you didn't have to worry about it. And that's not all. It's not just that you're here in this building and the chairs aren't falling apart and the floor is reliable and the electrical lights work and the sound quality is good and like all the technology is working, and there's people beetling away in the background like mad constantly everywhere, making sure that those impossible things keep happening so that you don't have to be distracted. But then you're also sitting with people who are roughly like you, roughly like you enough so that when they come into a venue like this, they know enough to sit down in the seats and face forward and not turn around and look at the person behind them, which would make them very nervous, right? Which would be an indication that that person isn't playing the same game as everyone else, and so God only knows what they're up to, because you just wouldn't want that, right? You wouldn't want the guy in front of you turning around and just looking at you for the next 90 minutes. And, well, it's worth thinking about why. Like, well, what are you thinking about? You're going to be sitting there looking like this. Your eyes are going to be darting around, and maybe you're going to be nudging someone and, pointing at this person because maybe they have some idea of what this person is up to, because you don't. And the problem is, if you don't know what that person is up to, then they could be up to anything. And anything is a lot of things to be up to. And you don't want people to be up to anything. You want them to be up to the one or two things they're supposed to be up to while they're with you in this narrow place that you occupy, right? And that's sort of the hallmark of a civilized and socialized person, is when we interact under 90% of conditions, 99% of conditions, you show me your persona. It's just a very narrow slice of yourself, and I show you mine at the bank, say, or at the grocery store, when we pass each other casually in the street. We nod and say hi, and you nod and say hi, or we just walk by peacefully, and like we're seething with complexity, and we don't let any of that out. And the reason for that is we don't want anybody else to let any of it out either. Right? So we keep ourselves simplified, and we build our architecture for that. And so, you come into a building like this, and the building tells you what to do. The chairs are all aligned. The chairs say, sit on me, right? The chairs are all facing the same way in kind of a semicircle, and they say, face the stage. And there's a stage. And so you come in here, and all the perceptual problems are solved. And so there's all this technology, and there's all this expense, and then there's the shared culture that enables you to know that this is something like a theatrical experience. And so what you do at a theatrical experience is come together as a group and remain silent but attentive, participating in that manner, and watch and listen to the main performance. And you all know that. It's part of the shared culture. And so that shared culture is also enabling you to perceive what you're perceiving right now as a protective mechanism. And that's part of a broader shared sense of civilization, and it's dependent on a shared government. And then there's other forms of protection, I mean, well, the sun isn't shining on us too brutally because we have a roof, and we're not in danger of warfare because you have borders, and you have an armed forces, and you have policemen, and it's like, Christ, there's just things going on around you like mad to ensure that you can sit here so peacefully and so much as if the world isn't a complex place for an hour and a half and do something this focused. And so that's partly how you solve the perceptual problem. You don't see the world that much. You screen a lot of it out. Now, there's a good illustration of this. A psychologist named Dan Simon did this famous experiment, which he called Gorillas in Our Midst. And some of you know about it, but I'm going to go over it because it's such a fun experiment to talk about, because it's so ridiculous and so illuminating, and because it's so relevant to what I want to continue talking to you about. So here's the deal. You go into Dan Simon's lab. He was at Harvard 20 years ago when he did this, and he was interested in this phenomena called change blindness. You see those kids' books sometimes where there's picture 1 and picture 2, and you're supposed to look at picture 1 and then look at picture 2 and see what's changed. It's actually hard. You look at picture 1, you say, well, I saw that. And then you look at picture 2, and it's different, but you can't see the differences. And you have to really compare back and forth before you can check out the differences. And that's what perception is like, is you're very blind to change, way more than you think. And way more than anybody thought before Simon did his experiments. And so he did this crazy experiment. So here's the setup. Video camera set up in front of a elevator bank, right? And so the camera would be here, the elevator bank would be about here, so it's pretty close-up shot. There's 6 people participating, 3 of them dressed in black, 3 of them dressed in white. The white team has a basketball, the black team has a basketball. They fill the whole screen, so it's not like they're way over in the corner this high and you can barely see them. They fill up the whole screen. You can detect their facial figures. It's close shot. You see their whole body, but it's clear. There's no tricks in it. And you sit there and you're the experimental subject, and the psychologist or his assistant says, okay, here's your task. And you're there to be focused on a task, apparently, because you're in a university and you're in a lab and you'd expect to be focused on a task. And so you're already primed for that, and you're willing to go along with it to be obedient. But to be a good sport, let's say, that's better than obedient. And you want to do a good job because it's intimidating to be in a lab like that. And so you want to do a good job of whatever you're supposed to do, unless you're a troublemaker. And you're probably not, because you wouldn't go into the lab to begin with if you were a troublemaker. So Simon says, count the number of times, like the white team is going to throw a basketball back and forth, a variety of ways, for 3 minutes. Just count how many times they manage it, and they're going to bounce it and throw it directly and all that. And so the black team and the white team start to mill around, on the video, and they're tossing the basketball back and forth, and you're watching the basketball very intently with the central part of your vision. Now, the central part of your vision is very high resolution, and you can tell this. It's pretty easy. I'll show you. I don't know. Now, this probably won't work because I think the theater is too big to do it. But we could try it, I guess. So look at my finger, all right? But pay attention to my face. Now, that's hard because usually when you pay attention to something, you look right at it. But I don't want you to do that. I want you to pay attention to my finger and look at my face. And what should happen, except perhaps for those of you who are quite a distance at the back, is that you'll notice that you actually can't see my facial features. So, for example, if I look at even somebody in the third row, if I look directly at you, I can see your facial features fine. I can tell you have glasses. I can't tell if you're male or female. I can't distinguish you from the chair, and it has nothing to do with you. Right. But you don't have to move very far away from central vision before it becomes extremely low resolution. And so that's how your visual system is set up. High resolution in the middle, low resolution as you move towards the periphery, until like out here, I actually can't tell how many, I know how many fingers I have. Well, 5 if you include the thumb, but I can't see them. If I move them, I can see them better. Because that's one of the ways your visual system overcomes its limitations, is that it's better at seeing movement than things that are stable. And that's because, well, if you're watching something and something suddenly moves, off to the right, it might be a good idea for you to shift your attention just to see what it is. And so that's a trick your visual system uses. But mostly it's foveal vision, and it's a very, very small part of your visual field, and it's extremely heavily neurologically innervated in the visual cortex. A lot of cells are devoted to that tiny area in the middle of your vision to make it as high resolution as possible. And it might be nice. Eagles have 2 fovea, by the way. They can see better than human beings. Their eyes, bald eagles, their eyes are as big as human beings, and they can see better than we can. They're the only animals that can do that. They have 2 fovea. But you can't have that high resolution vision across the entire span of your eyes, because then your head would have to be this big to carry that much brain around, and obviously that would be hideous and also counterproductive. So we do the best we can, and what it means is that we're blind to a lot of things that we don't think we're blind to. So anyways, so you're playing Dan Simon's game, and you're counting the number of times that the basketball is tossed back and forth between the white team, and he says how many times, and you say, being a good experimental participant, you say 16. And you're right, and he says you're right, and you think, oh, good, I'm smart enough to participate in a psychological experiment. And you feel good about yourself, It's a little self-respect boost, let's say, because you passed the test. And then Simon says, did you see anything out of the ordinary? And you say, most of you, some people notice, most of you say, no. What do you mean? And Simon says, well, the gorilla. Did you see the gorilla? And you think, well, what do you mean, did I see the gorilla? Like, there was no damn gorilla. I'd see a gorilla, right? If we're watching me on stage and a gorilla came out here, you'd see it. Maybe, as it turns out. It might depend on what the gorilla was doing. But in any case, so Simon rewinds the tape as you watch it, so that there's no tricks, and he says, don't count the balls this time, just watch. So it's a different command, right? So you have a different aim now. You're pursuing a different value structure. He says, just watch. And he rewinds it, and sure enough, you see the gorilla coming out backwards and being in the middle, and then going off to the side. And then he replays it for you. And minute and a half into the 3-minute video, in waltzes this damn gorilla. It's a guy, because they didn't have a gorilla for obvious reasons. Ethics committees wouldn't allow them to use a real gorilla. And he's a big guy. He's not a small chimpanzee-type ape. He's 6'4", and he saunters out there and beats his chest like for 4 seconds, right in the middle of the screen, which you might think you'd see since it's right in the middle of the screen, and then he saunters off to the side, and you don't see it. And the question is, well, what the hell's wrong with you? Like, why don't you see it? And it's worse than that. Like, Simon has done other funny tricks. Like, imagine you went to a grocery store, and the cashier was behind the counter, right? And you're talking to the cashier, and the cashier says, "Excuse me for a minute," and then kneels down, and then someone else stands up and keeps talking to you. And you think, "Oh, you're going to catch that." And you don't. About 50% of people miss that completely. So you can like change the person completely. And the reason is, well, how much processing do you have to do to have a casual interaction with a cashier at a grocery store? And the answer is, not much, right? You don't have to do the processing doesn't have to be that deep. And you can kind of tell this because you can watch The Simpsons, or you can watch South Park, and South Park has like the world's worst animation, right? I mean, everything moves like this. It's all circles and triangles, and you don't care. It's like 5 minutes into the narrative. It doesn't matter that it's circles and triangles having a conversation. It's fine. The icon will work. And that's a good rule for perception, is you use the simplest possible perceptual scheme that you can manage to get yourself from point A to point B, right? It's a map. You don't see the world. You see an iconic representation of the world. And then the question is, what makes the iconic representation sufficient? And I suppose sufficient means a couple of things. One thing it means is tolerable, right? It doesn't cause an excess of suffering and degeneration. It has to be functional, right? And then maybe a more specific example of that would be, well, it has to work, like a map works. A map is a low-resolution representation, but it's a good enough map if you use the map and you start at point A and you happen to be at point A, which is a good beginning for a map, and then you use the map and you get to point B and you think, good enough map. And that's really, that's us. That's how we think. That's how we construe the world. Our maps are really, the stories that we use in the world are really the maps we use to guide us. And they have perceptual implications. But that's essentially what you do. So now the question is, all right, what happened in the gorilla video? Well, what happened was you were aiming at something, right? You're aiming at counting the passes. And the question is, well, why were you doing that? And the answer is, well, someone told you to, asked you to. And then you might ask, well, why did you listen to them? There's lots of other things you might have done in the lab, but that isn't what you did. You did what you were asked to. And we might say, well, that's because you're reasonably cooperative and civilized. And then we might say, well, why is that a hallmark of cooperation and civilization? And we might say, well, reciprocity, like spontaneous reciprocity between strangers who have a bit of a contractual arrangement is part of civilized behavior, and so that's the appropriate thing to do. And we might say, well, you wanted to do a good job in the lab because you wanted to make sure that your status wasn't too low. You know, you could count to 16, and so you can give yourself a pat on the back of the head for that. And, you know, it's part of being a civilized person. And so there's a huge value structure behind that. Like, you didn't go into the lab and shoot it up, you know? You didn't bring a hand grenade, right? And you didn't sexually assault the experimenter. There's lots of things you could have done in there. And you didn't do those things. You just sat there and counted the balls and missed the gorilla. Okay, so, and there's complicated reasons for that. There are deep reasons for that. And so there are deep reasons for how you perceive things and why.
Are you depressed, or do you just have a horrible life? And those are not the same question, because if you're depressed, you have a life that in principle should work, but isn't. And so you come and say, look, I've got a lot of things going for me. You know, I've got a good job, I've got a good family, my wife loves me, but man, I'm miserable all the time. It's like, okay, well, let's delve into that a bit more deeply. But that kind of sounds like depression. But then you might come and say, well, I'm miserable, I'm suffering, I don't even want to be alive. And then I might ask, well, do you have an intimate partner? Well, no, not really. And I have had a history of catastrophic relationships. Do you have any friends? Well, you know, I have this one person I phone like once every month or so. But other than that, no, I don't really see anyone. Well, do you have any close family? No, my family's pretty fractured. I don't get along with my mom and dad. I don't see my sisters or my siblings much. It's like, well, how about a job? Or how about a career, or failing that, a job? It's like, well, I've always kind of been underemployed, and I just lost my job, and you know, that's not going very well, and so on. You can walk through someone's life and you can find out if they're reasonably embedded in a hierarchy of social institutions. And if the answer is no, no intimate partner, no family, no children, no friends, no job, no career, no educational pathway, no engagement in civic responsibility, let's say, no church attendance, no spiritual life, no routine. It's like, well, you're not depressed, you just have a horrible life. Multidimensionally. Like, it's no wonder you're depressed. There's nothing in your life that is working. But it's interesting because that's not exactly a diagnosis at the level of the individual. It's a diagnosis in relationship to the relationship between the individual and this structure of containing social institutions. If you don't have an intimate partner, and you don't have a family, and you don't have any friends, and you don't have a career or a job or any civic involvement or any involvement, let's say, with religious institutions, and you don't have any creative striving, all you've got left is pain. And so that's what you have. And so here's a different way of thinking about sanity. Sanity isn't being well constituted as an atomized individual. Sanity is what makes itself manifest if you're properly situated in a hierarchy of social order. To be well constituted, you have to be a harmonious player in a multidimensional symphony in some real sense of social interaction. It's very hard to stay on the straight and narrow without a partner who doesn't share your blind spots, correcting you constantly. You know, now that's annoying. There's a tussling about it, right? There's a fractious and adversarial element to that, because if you're married, you don't see eye to eye, and thank God for that, because sometimes in your foolish insistence on being right, you're wrong, and wrong in a way that'll take you out. And so you better have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And fortunately, if you have a partner, you have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And so if you can get the dialogue flowing, then that's a mutually corrective mechanism. And so then you might say, well, the truthful dialogue between partners in a marriage is actually, it's the process by which sanity itself is generated. And I mean technically, it's like you're too complex to regulate yourself, period. And so you need other people to help you do that. So if you have a wife or a husband, someone who knows you and is there for the long run, they can help, you can help each other find the meaningful path and stay on it. And you can't do that alone. And probably just having a partner isn't enough. You need kids, likely, to keep you sane or to drive you crazy, depending on the nature of your children, let's say. You need family, you need your parents, you need your siblings, you need another community around you that's not merely your wife, because you're so crazy that it takes a village to keep you sane. And so, and then surrounding that more intimate web of kinship, you need friends. And friends keep you sane. Well, how? Well, you have to act in a manner that makes them want to be around you to have friends. And that means that to maintain your friendships, you have to be saner than you really are, right? You have to be, they have to be able to enjoy their time with you. If you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that's just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you've got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure, you know, regardless of its scope? And the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise, in its deepest sense, is that process of preparation. And, you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal.
If you work 13% longer hours, you make 40% more money. It's nonlinear. So you think, why is that? Well, imagine you had 10 employees and one of them works an extra 10%. It's not much. Well, how often is that person going to be promoted, assuming you have a clue as a boss? It's like you're going to look at the 10 people and you're going to think, oh, that guy's always here like 45 minutes early. It's like, why don't we give him the promotion? Obviously, right? So these small edges that you can manage like that, work an extra 10% or extra 13%, have non-proportional payoffs. That's part of the Pareto distribution. So get your sleep cycle organized so you get up in the morning. Learn how to do it. No excuses. I'm too tired in the morning. I don't like mornings. Who cares? That's not relevant. It's like discipline yourself so you can manage it. Schedule your meals, because that's a good disciplinary routine. And then learn to use a calendar, like Google Calendar. Most of you, many of you out there, do not use a calendar. Okay, a calendar is not a prison, and it's not a tyrant. Not if you use it properly. A calendar keeps anxiety at bay. It makes sure that you do what you need to do, which is important, because otherwise you fall behind. But if you use it properly, it also helps you plan what you want to do. So I could say, well, lay out your damn calendar and design the days you would like to have. That's what your calendar is for. So you can put in all sorts of things in there you want to do, and that would be good for you. And that's a really good way to start being more industrious. Make a plan. You need a plan for 3 years. You need a plan for the next year. You need a plan for the next 6 months. You need a plan for the next 3 months. You need a plan for the week. You need a plan for the day. You need a plan for the hour. All of that. All of that. I make lists constantly of what I have to do. And they're like daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. Right now, I can't look out more than about 6 months, because my life is too complicated and chaotic. But you need a vision of who you could be, what character you could have. 3 to 5 years out, you can't go much farther than that because life is too unpredictable, I think, to make vision that's longer term than that subject to, there's too much chance associated with it to spend a lot of time on. Maybe you can stretch it to 5 years, and in rare cases, you can have a 10-year goal, but it has to be pretty low resolution. But you want plans at all those levels of resolution. You want to write the things down. And because what are you going to do? You're going to stumble around and get what you need? You're going to stumble around and be useful to other people? And it's useful to be useful to other people, They want to work with you then. They want to do things with you. They want to have you around. They trust you. They open up opportunities for you. And if you stumble around like you're blind, you're not going to get anywhere. And then you're going to suffer. And then you're going to be bitter. And then you're going to be cruel. So that's hell. That's a bad outcome. So unless you want that, don't aim for it. Or aim for the opposite, because that's how you get out of it. Make a plan, man. So when I was doing my clinical work, which I did a lot of career work with my clients, both at a beginner level, I would say, like really a beginner level, with people who had no employment whatsoever, no history of employment, who were undereducated and who lacked every skill you could possibly imagine. So these were people who were really in dire straits, up to people who were operating at the top of their profession, but who could still strategize forward. And so, for example, let's say you're at a dead end in your job. Okay, so I don't find my work meaningful. All right, so that's a problem statement. It's like, well, why not? I find the work I do repetitive and boring and without spirit. I have a bad relationship or a neutral relationship with my boss who doesn't know who I am. I have problems with coworkers. All of that needs to be differentiated, right, and analyzed in detail. So we might say, for example, let's say you believe that you're undervalued at work, and maybe you are. What you need to do is you have something to say, and we would have to figure out what it is that you have to say. But it would be some variant of, I'm bringing more value to the table than I'm being compensated for, and that's demoralizing me. And it's also not good for you being my boss, because if I'm actually more valuable than is being recognized, then the fact that you're not valuing me properly means that I will become demoralized, I won't work properly, and you won't get the best out of me. So it's bad for both of us. And if your boss is in principle not amenable to such a discussion, then what you should seriously consider doing is finding another job. Okay, so let's say we're going to set you up for this. Okay, this isn't like next week's enterprise, man. This is your life. So the first thing I would ask is, well, do you have your resume or CV in order? Well, I haven't typed it up for 3 years. Well, what do you think about bringing it up? Well, I'm pretty nervous about that because there's some holes in it, and, I didn't do so well in college, and I'm kind of embarrassed about my resume. It's like, okay, bring it in. Let's go through it. Let's at least update it. Let's look where the holes are. Let's look at where the inadequacies are as far as you're concerned, right? This isn't my judgment, it's your judgment. Let's walk through those judgments and see if they're warranted, because maybe you're just too guilty and ashamed and self-conscious and anxious, and you're looking at your resume more critically than someone else would, and maybe there's some holes that you need to rectify. You were 2 courses away from your BA and you dropped out or something like that. Well, maybe we need 6 months to address that. And at least, even if you can't be fully educated, you could be taking some courses online. And so when you went to a new job interview and they said, what about this hole? You'd say, well, I came to terms with that 6 months ago, and in an effort to rectify it, I'm taking the following courses, and here's my plan for completion. That's a really good answer. And anyone with any sense who's interviewing will accept that as an indication that although you're not perfect, and who is, that you have a good plan and that you've thought it through. Like, that's the kind of answer that in all likelihood will cement your candidacy for the position. Okay, so now you're going to go to your boss. Well, you have to have your CV and your resume in order.
And you have to be able to stand on it solidly, and which at least means that you're prepared to address the inadequacies in a credible, realistic, believable, and truthful manner. All right, now what you do is apply for like 10 jobs. You don't have to take them, but maybe you have to go to an interview or 2 or 3 or 4, and maybe there's a bunch of opportunities out there for you that you didn't even know about. And maybe someone offers you a job. And so now you can go to your boss and say, here's the situation I'm in here at work. Here's my evaluation of the problems in relationship to me. Here's what I could do for you if you gave me a 40% raise and the opportunity to progress, but I'd like to see a plan for that. And I've been looking for other opportunities before conducting this discussion, and I have some. If your boss treats you with contempt at that point and doesn't listen, then perhaps he or she is a little more narcissistic than might be optimal, and it's time to find a new job. But this isn't something you do trivially. And so when you're doubtful, say you're trapped, you ask yourself, well, why am I trapped? And that's a hard question, right? Because some of it's your own inadequacy, a lot of it. And all of the part of it that you can deal with is your own inadequacy. So even if it's unfair, you know, even if you're hemmed in for any number of reasons, inappropriate, like ethnically predicated oppression, let's say, or maybe you're in a workplace that really is sexist in some fundamental sense. Well, that's not good. It's not just, it's not fair, it's not meritorious, all of those things. And maybe you shouldn't be there. But what you can do to begin with is every bloody thing you possibly can do to put yourself in the most virtuous and powerful negotiating position possible. And you have to think like a snake in some sense. To do that, you got to get the details right. You have to be prepared to bite, and you have to have your eyes on the prize, so to speak.
Idea in Jungian psychology called the circumambulation. And Jung had this idea that you had a potential future self, which would be in potential everything that you could be, and that it manifests itself moment to moment in your present life by making you interested in things. And the things that you're interested in are the things that would guide you along the path that would lead you to maximal development. Now, it sounds like a metaphysical idea or a mystical idea even, but it's not. It's not. It's a really profoundly biological idea. The idea is something like, well, you're set up so that you're automatically interested in those things that would fully expand you as a well-adapted creature. Well, like, there's nothing radical about that idea. What else could possibly be the case? Unless there's something fundamentally flawed about you, that is what the situation would be. It's kind of interesting to think about how that would be manifest moment to moment, but the idea is something like, well, your interest is captured by those things that lead you down the path of development. Well, that better be the case. Okay, so that's fine. And so there's some utility in pursuing those things that you're interested in. That's the call to adventure, let's say. So, and the call to adventure takes you all sorts of places. Now, the problem with the call to adventure is, like, what the hell do you know? You might be interested in things that are kind of warped and bent. And often it's the case that when new parts of people manifest themselves and grip their interests, say, they do it very badly and shoddily. And so you stumble around like an idiot when you try to do something new. That's why the fool is the precursor to the savior from the symbolic perspectives, because you have to be a fool before you can be a master. And if you're not willing to be a fool, then you can't be a master. So you're gonna, it's an error-ridden process. And that's also laid out in the Old Testament stories, because the first thing that happens to all these patriarchal figures when God kicks them out of their father's house when they're like 84 is that they run into all sorts of trouble, and some of it's social and some of it's natural and some of it's a consequence of their own moral inadequacy. So they're fools. But the thing that's so interesting is that despite the fact that they're fools, they're still supposed to go on the adventure, and that they're capable of learning enough as a consequence of moving forward on the adventure so that they straighten themselves out across time. And so it's something like this. So this circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual, we'll return to this continual circling, in some sense, of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. So imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is 0. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is 0. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely, highly likely. So you have, there's, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being, you know, you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all.
People don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because, you know, you might be wrong about what you want easily, but maybe you could get what would really be good for you. Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, you know, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And it's strange because they don't it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple, because, you know, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that, and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. You know, so you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so, since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is 0. And so there's a proposition here, and the proposition is, if you actually want something, you can have it. Now the question then would be, well, what do you mean by actually want? And the answer is that you reorient your life in every possible way to make the probability that that will occur as certain as possible. And that's a sacrificial idea, right? It's like, you don't get everything, obviously, but maybe you can have what you need. And maybe all you have to do to get it is ask. But the asking isn't a whim or today's wish. It's like, you have to be deadly serious about it. You have to think, okay, like, I'm taking stock of myself. And if I was going to live properly in the world, and I was going to set myself up such that being would justify itself in my estimation, and I don't mean as a harsh judge, exactly what is it that I would aim at? Sit on your bed one day and ask yourself,
what remarkably stupid things am I doing on a regular basis to absolutely screw up my life? And if you actually ask that question, but you have to want to know the answer, right? Because that's actually what asking the question means. It doesn't mean just mouthing the words. It means you have to decide that you want to know. You'll figure that out so fast it'll make your hair curl.
You write in the book, there is no faith and no courage and no sacrifice in doing what is expedient. What do you say to those viewers that don't pursue their dreams and are locked in their careers because they are too afraid to take risks and pursue something meaningful?
Well, the first thing I would say is, well, you should be afraid of taking risks and pursuing something meaningful. But you should be more afraid of staying where you are if it's making you miserable. You're paying a price by sitting there being miserable. You might say, well, the devil I know is better than the one I don't. It's like, don't be so sure of that. The clock is ticking.
Yeah,
and if you're miserable in your job now and you change nothing, in 5 years you'll be much more miserable and you'll be a lot older.
But isn't it a luxury to pursue what is meaningful? Our viewers have mortgages, they have children,
Yeah.
they have payments and loans. It's
Well,
a luxury to pursue because we lack the resources.
Well, I don't remember now, I'm not talking about what makes you happy. It's a luxury to pursue what makes you happy. It's a moral obligation to pursue what you find meaningful. And that doesn't mean it's easy. It might require sacrifice. If you need to change your job too, let's say you have a family and children and a mortgage, you have responsibilities. You've already picked up those responsibilities. You don't just get to walk away scot-free and say, well, I don't like my job, I quit. That's no strategy. But what you might have to do is you think, well, this job is killing my soul. All right, so what do I have to do about that? Well, I have to look for another job. Well, no one wants to hire me. It's like, okay, maybe you need to educate yourself more. Maybe you need to update your curriculum vitae, your resume. Maybe you need to overcome your fear of being interviewed. Maybe you need to sharpen your social skills. Like, you have to think about these things strategically. If you're going to switch careers, you have to do it like an intelligent, responsible person. That might take you a couple of years of effort to do properly.
We're built for struggle, us human beings. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge, and the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world, and you take the slings and arrows of fate, and you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail, and fortune might do you in, but it's your best bet. And, you know, people have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And so, and I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You know, you're doing fine in life and then you get cancer, and then 6 months later you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend. And you develop by contending, and you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do.
So you're at a particular stage right now, and that stage would involve a particular worldview and the behaviors that go along with that. So the perceptions and behaviors. But it's not enough because you haven't mastered the whole world, and you're making mistakes all the time. And then there's other neurological mechanisms that, so maybe that's a more left hemisphere phenomenon, the instantiation of that identity. Then there's right hemisphere mechanisms that are tracking your errors and sort of and keeping track of them. And the errors are an indication that your theory is incomplete. So the errors accumulate and the information around the errors accumulate, and another identity starts to become formulated, and it solves all the problems your previous identity did, but also some additional ones. When you have an aha moment like that, it's the manifestation of that next identity that's making itself known. It's you know, because it's being built from the bottom up. It isn't explicit yet. And then you'll encounter an explicit statement. You mentioned a couple there, and they map onto that. And that's the aha. It's like, oh yes, that's what ties together these things that I've been wrestling with in the back of my mind.
Most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And so, and that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. And so that's also Darwinian in some sense. You know, you're creating all these little enterprises that are sort of alive. They're run by people, after all, and even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, you know, what do they say? If at first you fail, then try again. And that would probably mean try something different rather than the same thing. But persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. You know, and some of that's useful because there's probably some things that you could improve about yourself. But it's very difficult to go from 0 to 1, you know. If you're starting out as a salesperson, for example, the hardest sale is the first customer. And then, you know, they get easier with each additional customer. You got to know that there are differences in intelligence. It's really important. If you go into a job and you're not smart enough for that job, you're going to have one bloody miserable time. And you're going to make life wretched for the people around you because you won't be able to handle the position. But what you really want to do, as far as I can tell, if you want to maximize your chances for both success and let's say well-being, is you want to find a strata of occupation in which you would have an intelligence that would put you in the upper quartile. That's perfect. Then you're a big fish in a small pond. And you don't want to be the stupidest guy in the room. It's a bloody rough place to be. So, and you probably don't want to be the smartest guy in the room either, because what that probably means is you should be in a different room. If you want to be the best at what you're doing, bar none, then having an IQ of above 145 is a necessity, and maybe you're pushing 160 in some situations, and maybe that's making you one person in 10,000 or even one person in 100,000. And then also, to really be good at it, you probably have to be reasonably stress tolerant and also somewhat conscientious.
There's nothing you can possibly do to become more deadly than to improve your facility with language. And the way you do that is by reading, especially great things, and by writing, and by thinking, and by speaking, for that matter. But how could that not be viewed as absolutely central to what education is about? You want to be inarticulate and stumble over everything that you try to think and communicate? Yeah. How are you going to get anywhere? You don't even know who you are under those circumstances. You're this massive feeling that's expressing itself, you know, maybe in violence because you can't find the words. And you stumble around and bump into things, and you're clunky and dull, and you're not witty. You don't sparkle. It's from the uphill climb that we derive our value, and I mean this technically. So almost all the positive emotion we feel, especially the emotion that fills us with enthusiasm, and that's experienced in relationship to a goal. And so in some sense, you want a goal that you can never attain. So you can always move closer to the goal that recedes as you move towards it. You think, well, that's frustrating. It's like Sisyphus pushing the rock uphill. But it's not, because as you pursue that goal, you put yourself together and your life does get better and richer and more abundant. And that's why the highest levels of virtue and goal are in some sense transcendent. You want them to be above everything you're doing so you can continually move towards something that's more sublime and better. That's what you are. You're here to live, not to sleep. And the problem with the vision of Mai Tais on the beach is that, well, first of all, that's a vision of drug-induced unconsciousness. Second, it's only going to work for about a week. Third, you're going to be a laughingstock in a month and depressed and aimless and goalless. You want a horizon of ever expanding possibility. And so it does happen to people because they've staked their soul on the attainment of an instrumental goal. And it can be a pretty high order goal, but then you think, now I'm there, now what? Well, the answer can't be, well, I'm going to live in the lap of luxury and never have to leave the what do you want to be, a giant infant with a gold with a gold bottle. You never have to do anything but lay in your back and suck. It's like, you see the problem with that as a conceptualization. It's no, you want to be like an active warrior moving uphill with your sword in hand. And that's dynamic, that's exciting.
One of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win. The possibility that you can make yourself slightly better on a continual basis is, I think that's something that's accessible to everyone. I think that's equivalent to leading a virtuous life. There is something to be said for virtue and truth, you know, and that is one thing. Another thing that I've noticed about people who've been phenomenally successful is that they really do everything they can to live a truthful life. And you can get a bloody long ways by being honest. Lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer. It's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. And so virtually every freedom that you have in life that's true freedom is purchased at the price of discipline.
But it's not some casual self-help doctrine. It's that if you don't organize yourself properly, you'll pay for it, and in a big way, and so will the people around you. And I would say, start where you can start. You know, if something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you know, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do, hands down.
People are afraid of the truth because often if you reveal it, it causes conflict in the moment. Telling the truth is definitely an adventure. Seeking for sure, but also telling. Another way of going about it is to just say what you think and see what happens. That's an adventure because you don't know what the outcome is going to be. So look, there's this old idea that it's necessary to have faith in the truth. And so here's a way of thinking about that. Someone asks you a question and you might think, well, here's the outcome I want, and so here's how I'm going to answer that question. So that's one way of approaching it. But another way of approaching it is, you ask me a question, I'm going to think about the answer, and I'm just going to tell you what I think. And it doesn't matter what the outcome is, because I'm willing to see what the outcome will be, predicated on the idea that there isn't a better outcome than the one that truth produces. Even if it's harsh and terrible in the short term, and sometimes it is, it's like there isn't a better way of doing it. Now, you might say, well, how do you know that? And the answer is, well, I don't know that. That's why it's an article of faith, because I believe, and I believe this deeply, the being that you produce as a consequence of telling the truth is good, by definition, even though it's harsh and often uncomfortable, because you get in trouble. One of the things that I've really learned recently, or learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. The first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community. Well, good for you. That's responsibility, and that's an aim. Well, here's one of the things that's cool about that, is that your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration. And then people have nothing.
Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile.
There's this old story in King Arthur where the knights go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is either the cup that Christ drank out of at the Last Supper, or the cup into which the blood that gushed from his side was poured when he was crucified. The stories vary, but it's basically a holy object, like the phoenix in some sense, that's a representation of transformation. So it's an ideal, and so King Arthur's knights, who sit at a round table because they're all roughly equal, go off to find the most valuable thing. And where do you look for the most valuable thing when you don't know where it is? Well, each of the knights looks at the forest surrounding the castle and enters the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's a good thing to understand, because the gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. And that's why there's, you know, an idiosyncratic element of it for everyone. Your particular place of enlightenment and terror is not going to be the same as yours, except that they're both places of enlightenment and terror. So they're equivalent at one level of analysis and different at another. So anyways, back to fiction and what it does. It distills truth, and it produces characters that are composites. And the more they become composites, the more they approximate a mythological character. And so they become more and more universally true and more approximating religious deities. But the problem with that is they become more and more distant from individual experience. And so with literature, there's this very tight line where you need to make the character more than merely human, but not so much of a god that, you know, one of the things that happened to Superman in the 1980s, Superman started out, he's got a heavenly set of parents, by the way, and an earthly set of parents, and he's an orphan like Harry Potter. Very common theme is that when Superman first emerged, he could only jump over buildings, you know, and maybe he could stop a locomotive. But by the time the 1980s rolled around, like, he could juggle planets and, you know, swallow hydrogen bombs, and, you know, he could do anything. Well, people stopped buying the Superman comics because how interesting is that? It's like something horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And something else horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And it's like, that's dull. He turned into such an archetype. He was basically the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God, and that's no fun. It's like God wins, and then God wins again, and then again God wins, and, you know. So then they had to weaken him in different ways with kryptonite, you know. So green kryptonite kind of made him sick, and red kryptonite, I think, kind of mutated him, if I remember correctly. And anyways, they had to introduce flaws into his character so that there could be some damn plot. And that's something to think about, you know. There's a deep existential lesson in that your being is limited and flawed and fragile. You're like the genie, which is genius in the little tiny lamp, you know, this immense potential, but constrained in this tiny little living space, as Robin Williams said when he played the genie in Aladdin. But the fact that you have limitations means that the plot of your life is the overcoming of those limitations, and that if you didn't have limitations, well, there wouldn't be a plot, and maybe there would be no life. And so that's part of the reason why perhaps you have to accept the fact that you're flawed and insufficient, and live with it and consider it a precondition for being. It's at least a reasonable idea. So anyways, one of the main characters is the country, the known, the explored territory. We went over that a bit, and it always has two elements. I mean, your country is your greatest friend and your worst enemy, you know, because it squashes you into conformity and demands that you act in a certain manner and reduces your individuality to that element that's tolerated by everyone else, and it constrains your potential in a single direction, and so it's really tyrannical. But at the same time, it provides you with a place to be and all of the benefits that have accrued as a result of the actions of your ancestors and all the other people that you're associated with. So there's the good tyrant or the bad tyrant and the good king, and those are archetypal figures, and that's because they're always true, and they're always true simultaneously, you know, which is partly why I object to the notion of the patriarchy, because it's a it's the what do you call that? It's the apprehension of a mythological trope, which is that of the evil tyrant, without any appreciation for the fact that the archetype actually has two parts, and the other part is the wise king. And you know, you can tell an evil tyrant story about culture, no problem, but it's one-sided, and that's very dangerous, because you don't want to forget all the good things that you have while you're criticizing all the ways that things are in error. That's a lack of gratitude, and it's a lack of wisdom, and it's founded in resentment, and it's very dangerous, both personally and socially. I told you that Captain Hook is a tyrant because he's got this crocodile chasing him, and the crocodile has a clock in its stomach, and that's death. It's like, obviously, right? Tick, 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 tick. And it's a crocodile, and it's under the water, and it's already got a taste of him, so he's being chased around by death, and that makes him terrified and resentful and cruel and bitter, and so he's a tyrant. And he wants to wreak havoc everywhere. And then Peter Pan, of course, looks at Captain Hook and thinks, why the hell should I grow up and to be a tyrant and sacrifice all the potential of childhood? And the answer to that is, the potential sacrifices itself if you don't utilize it as you mature, and you just end up a 40-year-old lost boy, which is a horrifying thing to behold. It's almost as if you're the corpse of a child, the living corpse of a child, because who the hell wants a 6-year-old, 40-year-old? You're a little on the stale side by that point, and not the world's happiest individual. So, you know, your potential is going to disappear because you age anyways, and so you might as well shape that potential in a particular direction and at least become something, no matter how limited, rather than nothing. So, you know, Peter Pan, that's a great story. It's a great mythological story. So, well, so let's talk about tyrants. Well, not only are they mythological figures, but they exist, and they tend to be deified. I mean, Stalin was, for all intents and purposes, God the Father in Soviet Russia, although he was pretty much only the worst elements of Old Testament God, who was, you know, constantly smiting people and wiping out populations and doing all sorts of things that seemed to be quite nasty. But nonetheless, you know, people worshipped him in many ways, and he's a representation of just exactly what goes wrong when things really go wrong, when people stop paying attention and when they all lie. Because one of the things that characterized the communist state was that no one ever got to say anything they actually believed, ever. And that was partly because 1 out of 3 people was an informer, which meant if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of them were informing on the government about you, and that included your own children. And if you were an informer, you were often amply rewarded by the state, so that if you lived in an overcrowded apartment building with 3 families in the same flat, and you informed on, you know, the woman down the hall that you didn't like, she got shipped off to the old concentration camp, and you got her apartment. And so that was a lovely society, and it only killed about 30 million people between 1919 and 1959. So that's what happens when the archetypal structure gets tilted badly, when people forget that they have a responsibility to fulfill as citizens, as awake citizens who are capable of stating the truth, and the archetype shifts, so there's nothing left of the great father except the tyrant. And let's not have that happen. I mean, the one on the right is really interesting because consciously or unconsciously, you know, there's Stalin surrounded by what is for all intents and purposes fire. You know, he looks like Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty when she shows up at Aurora's christening. You know, she puts her arms up in the air and green fire surrounds her. It's like he's surrounded by fire, and there's Lenin above him who's like king of the fiery realm, and that's for sure. So I mean, all the terrors that happened in the Soviet Union didn't start under Stalin, they started under Lenin, and Stalin was definitely Lenin's legitimate son, let's put it that way. It's funny that philosopher Kierkegaard, you don't usually hear a joke that starts like that, by the way. He wrote 150 years ago, and he was one of the first people who really wrote about anxiety. He was one of the first psychological philosophers. And he regarded himself as rather useless, all things considered. And he wrote a section in one of his books about all the industrialists that were operating in Europe at that time, trying in every possible way to make life easier and easier and more efficient and productive for everyone, which was definitely happening during the Victorian period, and Europe was rapidly transforming into an industrial powerhouse. And he said, someone as useless as him, with an orientation towards being a student who liked to sit and contemplate ideas and talk in cafes and smoke cigars and drink, could never do anything to make anything easier for anyone than everyone was already trying to make it. And so he thought that his task would be to make things more difficult for people, because there would come a time when what people wanted wasn't more ease, but more challenge and more difficulty. And that's really smart, you know, and it's witty and it's true. And one of the things that I've come to understand, I believe, is that, and Dostoevsky knew this too. He wrote about this in Notes from Underground. It's a great book, very short book, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, compelling, dark read. It's the confession of a miserable, resentful, like murderously genocidal bureaucrat who evaluates his own soul, I suppose, and confesses his sins. And it's also a critique of the idea of utopia oriented towards security. And Dostoevsky, who was dealing with the set of ideas that are really tearing us apart culturally right now, this idea of a eventual utopia based on something like security and safety. Dostoevsky really objected to that back in this like 1860, a long time ago. He said, you know, the thing about people that you don't really understand is that, he said, fundamentally we're ungrateful and we can curse. That's what distinguished us from the animals, which I thought is pretty damn comical. But he said something very interesting, you know. He said, if you set up a utopia so that all people had to do was eat cakes and busy themselves with the continuation of the species, that, yeah, right, Russian humor, you know, that after a surfeit of that, after enough of that, which would happen quite quickly, people would just go mad just to break things, just so something unexpected and remarkable could happen, and that we're not built for security and safety, but for something, well, let's call it adventure, something like adventure. That's a good thing to know, you know, because you don't want to suffer unduly. That seems reasonable. And you might think, because of that, that really what you want is happiness. But then Solzhenitsyn, for example, he wrote about what happened in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin and said, you know, if your goal is happiness, what are you going to do when the jackboots hammer down your door at 2 in the morning and haul you off to the prison camp, because you're not going to be happy there. And so, you know, happiness is a boat that's easily capsized and the waves are always there. And so if your philosophy is one of, say, impulsive happiness, same sort of thing Dostoevsky was pointing at, and Kierkegaard, then you're not prepared when all hell breaks loose. And all hell, it will absolutely 100% break through at some point in your life, and you're lucky if it won't be decades. You know, it'll certainly be some of it, and it might be a lot of it, and for some of you it's going to be damn near the whole thing. And so if what floats your boat is happiness, you're going to be capsized by the first decent wave. And so then you might ask yourself, you know, what do you have instead of happiness that might be even more reliable? And I do think that adventure is more reliable than happiness. And in the Old Testament story of Abraham, founder of the Abrahamic faiths, and obviously what would you call it, a crucial figure in the development of world culture, Abraham is presented as a late bloomer, to say the least. He's like 83. People lived longer back then, at least so the story goes. And he had a very rich father by nomadic standards, and he could just sit around in the tent all day. And, you know, a doting mother and a rich father, he could just sit around in the tent all day and eat peeled grapes and busy himself with the continuation of the species. And but, you know, God appears to him and says, get away, get out of your security, get out of your comfort, leave your family, leave your community, leave your nation, go out into the world. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting story. It's very interesting to contemplate it from both a psychological and a religious perspective, because what God is presented as in that book, which is a crucial book for as I said, for world culture, is God is presented as the manifestation of the Spirit that calls even the too secure and pampered to adventure. And then Abraham has a pretty rough time when he goes out and has his adventure. It's not all, you know, Skittles and roses from then on in. Quite the contrary. And he runs right away into like a conspiracy of elites to steal his wife. He runs into tyranny, runs into starvation. He encounters war. It's like he goes out in the world and he has the whole tragedy of his life, both on the social and political front and individually, you know. But the promise is the promise of adventure, and the implication is that if you have a sufficient adventure, then that cannot so much protect you from suffering, because perhaps that is impossible, but to justify it. And because you kind of know this in your own life. When you look at your life, you might look back on travails that you've undertaken, you know, and they've done end-of-life surveys with people and asked them what they regret. And, you know, people don't regret what they did that didn't work. They regret what they didn't do that could have worked. You know, they regret the chances they didn't take. And, you know, even if you do an evaluation of your biography, one of the things that you want to be able to say to yourself is something like, maybe there's nothing better you can say to yourself than this. You can think about this for yourself and see if it's true. That was extraordinarily difficult, but it was worth it. And, you know, it's not like you can have one of those without the other, because you can't imagine that you could have some confidence in what you've managed to accomplish, right? The kind of confidence that would instill you with a certain genuine sense of self-regard despite your fundamental inadequacy. To have that fundamental sense of self-regard that's grounded in something real, it has to be based in a narrative that approximates that was extremely difficult, but it was worth it. You have to have both of those. And so that's interesting, because one of the questions we always ask ourselves, this is the theodicy question, technically. You see the suffering in the world, you see the suffering of children, you see maybe your own children or your suffering, and you wonder, well, how can reality be constituted so that I can have faith in its essence when there is so much suffering? And one answer to that is something like, well, how much suffering do you want? And you might think, none. It's like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. You want, at least you want something approximating optimized challenge. So you could say, at least you want to be pushed to your limit. And maybe you find the most exciting times in your life. In fact, you'll pay for this, you'll pay to have this experience, to be pushed to your limit, not beyond it, or maybe even a bit beyond it, you know? And maybe not so far beyond it that you crumble and break and things fall apart, but, you know, could you be pushed to your limit optimally if there wasn't the possibility of falling apart and breaking? Like, that's an open question. How are you ever going to take something seriously if the consequences aren't actually serious? You know, and there's something delightful about dancing on the edge. That's why Hawaiians believed that surfing was sacred, you know, and it's because to surf you have to be on the edge, right? And the waves can come and take you out at any moment, but without the possibility of the waves rising to take you out, then you can't dance on the edge, and maybe that's exactly what you want to do, you know, and there's good evidence from the neuroscience literature that consciousness itself is something akin to dancing on the edge. So technically, when you're conscious, when you're awake, your brain is occupying a position between something. It's a position that's something like between chaos and order. And if your brain's maximally ordered, well, you're just bored, nothing is changing. And if you're chaotic, then it's anxiety and catastrophe. But you want to be positioned right between those two, and that's when your consciousness is optimized, you know? And when your consciousness is optimized, then you're deeply engaged in life and everything seems alive and meaningful. And maybe that's the solution in some profound sense to the problem of suffering. It's that you optimize your interaction with chaos rather than being protected all the time from everything that could hurt you. And you kind of know this too if you have kids, because you don't want to keep your kids in an infantile state, and because when they're infants, pretty much what you do with them, say they're 6 months and younger, is you just keep them secure and safe, right? You just provide everything that you can for them. You have to do that because, well, what are they going to do? They just lay there fundamentally and squawk now and then. I mean, it's not like they're ambulatory. They can't go out and do things for themselves, and so it's up to you, and your goal is to keep them secure and safe. But once they start being able to move around, then increasingly it's sort of up to them. And if you have any sense as a parent, the psychoanalysts used to say, the good mother necessarily fails. And what did they mean by that? They meant, well, you know, if you're committed to your infant when you're a mother for the first 6 months, it's like it's all the kid, 100%, full self-sacrifice devoted towards the infant. That's the right attitude. But even by 9 months, child can crawl around quite a lot. They're developing something of an independent will. You start handing them challenges. You start handing them responsibility, and you keep them on the edge. And some of your kids are going to be able to be pushed harder than others, and part of the reason you have to develop a relationship with your kids, and your husband for that matter, is so that, you know, you can keep them dancing on the edge, on the proper edge. And that's even better than the mere provision of security.
There's so little emphasis in our popular culture, especially with regards to the so-called mainstream media, on discipline and responsibility, that there's a tremendous hunger for anything that pertains to that. And you have a right to be discussing that, I would say, because of your background, which, if nothing else, required a tremendous amount of discipline.
Yeah, and I ended up writing a book called Discipline Equals Freedom. And I'm lucky that I wrote it when I did, because if I would have written it 2 years later, everyone would have said, oh, everyone's talking about discipline now. So yeah, discipline, absolutely. Discipline does bring you freedom in life. And that's something that I kind of figured out over time.
So what do you mean by that? Like, how did you figure that out? And what do you mean by that? Because they're often, and you know, the classic sort of, what would you call it? Romantic rebel is someone who is free from excessive order, let's say. They see freedom and discipline as antithetical rather than seeing one as a precondition for the other. And so how did you learn that discipline was a precondition for freedom? If I've got the equation, how did that manifest itself in your own life?
So we'll start off by saying this. And look, I was a young kid. I joined the Navy to go in the SEAL teams. I went through SEAL training. I showed up at a SEAL team 1. And when I got there, and as I look back, this is a very powerful thing, even though it's very simple. So I'm 19 years old when I show up at SEAL Team 1. I'm done with the basic SEAL training. And I have a goal in my head, which is this. I want to be a good SEAL. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to do. That's like, I don't know about anything else. this is what I want to do.
that.
I want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. I want to be a good SEAL. And so as a 19-year-old with all kinds of energy, and we haven't talked about my childhood yet, but I was kind of like a very rebellious kid. When you talked about seeing a kid that looked like you could have handed him a club or a battle axe and he would have probably been feeling a little bit better, I was like that. I was constantly looking around for a club or a battle axe because that's what I felt like I needed to do. And it was beautiful because I was running around the woods as a young kid playing Army. And I just went and actually played Army. That's what I ended up doing. So I never really had to force myself into some mold that I didn't want to be into. So I got to SEAL Team 1, and now I just want to be a good SEAL. That's what I want. And so now that starts steering some of my decisions. And for the most part, it steered my decisions in a decent direction. Now, there were some times where, as I look back now, what I thought was a good SEAL was a little bit off, but luckily it wasn't 180 degrees off. It might've been off 30 degrees or 40 degrees.
Right.
And as I got older and more mature and I figured out more about what that ideal should look like to me, and I could keep chasing that ideal, that was good. But even to be a 19-year-old kid with a 70 or 80 degree corridor to move forward in is not a bad thing.
No, it's a gift.
It's a gift. Exactly. So then I'm looking around at other SEALs that were older than me and more senior to me and trying to figure out which one of those guys is a good SEAL.
Yeah.
And what I realized was that the guys that were working harder, for the most part, were good SEAls. Now there's just some people that are just way talented.
Right.
And they could show up, 3 minutes before a run or 3 minutes before we do a shooting competition, and they could just walk through it, no problem.
Right.
And that's great for them. It wasn't me. I'm not that great at anything, but I saw other guys that might not be great at anything either, but they worked hard. They showed up to work early. They did the drills that they were supposed to do. They had discipline. And when you have
has amalgamated statistics, and I hope I get this right, but it's approximately correct. If you work 10% longer hours, you make 40% more money. Right. And so, and I think your comments about talent are also dead on. It's like in any field of enterprise, there are people who are phenomenally gifted. And then if they work really hard, they're even more phenomenally gifted, right? Those are the people who break records. But that talent apart, hard work actually works. And with virtually everything, it might not make you the best at whatever it is you're pursuing, but it will certainly make you better than you are. And then I have this new book. I hope you got a copy, because did you get a copy? Okay, so I'm bringing it up for a particular reason. I have a chapter in this book called, there's two that are relevant. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. That's one. And then the course, or what would you call it? A complementary chapter is work as hard as you possibly can on one thing and see what happens. And that's also predicated on this idea that discipline is a precondition to freedom. So you were fortunate, like you had this goal, right? So that meant you had a goal, which is a really big deal because you could learn about goals. You had a sense of a higher mode of moral being, that I would rather be a good SEAL than the person I am now. Well, it's a code of behavior and a way of perceiving. So there's an ethic in that. And then you said as well, your conception of what good SEAL meant changed as you matured, but that's also fine. It wouldn't have changed unless you would have pursued that initial only partially accurate goal. And so that's also a really good thing for people to understand is like, if you don't know what you're doing, aim at something. Is it the right thing? No, but it's better than just shooting randomly. So you aim at something, and then as you aim and you move towards it, you're going to find out why you're wrong. And then you might recalibrate your aim. And that's going to happen over and over because as you move towards a goal, it recedes or it broadens or it recedes and broadens. And otherwise you'd run out of things to do. If you're going to be an entrepreneur, you almost have the opposite profile as a soldier.
You're very high in openness, and you're lower in conscientiousness, or at least conscientiousness is irrelevant. And the reason for that seems to be that, like, if you're an orderly person and you like to follow procedures and rules, it's kind of hard for you to start a company, because when you first start a company or engage in any other creative process, because entrepreneurs turn out to be the same as artists, you kind of have to, you're not operating within a rule-governed structure. In fact, there may be many times where you have to break a small rule to move properly at a higher level of analysis. There's no algorithmic way of generating a new company, right? Obviously. And so it's people who are very high in openness who happen to be good entrepreneurs. And so this is something I thought was extraordinarily cool, because we'd also already known what predicts managerial, administrative, and academic ability. And IQ is crucial for any complex job, so we'll just leave that behind. But what predicts academic ability, for example, at the University of Toronto, is intelligence, obviously, but also conscientiousness. The correlation between creativity and grades at the U of T is 0. Right. But it's not surprising. The thing is, you know, it's easy to be cynical about that, but one of the things you have to understand about creative people is that they continually step outside of the domain of evaluation structures, right? Because if you're going to say you're going to evaluate the performance of 100 professors on their lecturing ability, well, you kind of have to measure what's common across all the professors in order to come up with the standards for evaluation. Well, that means you're not going to be able to use that structure to evaluate a particularly creative professor, because he or she is going to do something in a way that's so different that it won't show up on the evaluation measure. And of course, that's what happens in universities. You know, somebody sent me a couple of days ago, somebody sent me an essay that they had written for their master's thesis that was wildly creative, and they were basically told to leave the program. And that they couldn't continue. Not in a mean way. What happened was that what they were thinking was so outside of the conventions in the discipline is that no one had any idea what to do with the essay. So and that's really the lot of creative people, right? They're always stepping outside of evaluation structures. And so it's not that surprising that the relationship between creativity and grades at the U of T is 0. We found out as well, by looking at graduate student performance across multiple institutions, that there was a negative correlation between creativity and graduate school performance. It wasn't even 0, it was worse than negative. Being creative was negative. And you think, well, that could make you cynical as well, but you can't be cynical in that way, because one of the things that happens in science is that science tends to progress incrementally rather than in great leaps. Now and then someone comes along who blows the structure out of a science and advances it ridiculously, like Einstein. But like, most people aren't Einstein, and maybe thank God for that. Most of the time you're in a discipline, you understand the discipline, and then once you've developed understanding of the discipline, you know what the next micro question is that should be answered. And part of the reason that science is so powerful is because it allows people who aren't genius level creatives to make real advances in the generation of knowledge, one tiny micro step at a time. It doesn't matter if there's 100,000 people doing it and each of them is making a micro step. Man, we're zipping along as fast as we possibly want to zip along. And so it turns out to be conscientiousness that's the excellent predictor of graduate student performance. That's the best predictor for law. It's the best predictor for managerial positions. It's the best predictor for administrative positions. Anything that has a structure of rules that needs to be applied, conscientiousness is a great predictor. So, but it's not good for predicting artistic ability or entrepreneurial ability. And that's also really important, because one of the things, this is partly why bureaucracies stultify, right? Because what happens is as they develop, they get chock full of conscientious people, with a few psychopaths thrown in there just for good measure. They get chock full of conscientious people busily zooming efficiently down a single track, and then all of a sudden the landscape shifts and they're going very, very efficiently in exactly the wrong direction, and then the whole bloody thing falls apart. So you need to have some creative wingnuts in your organization to come up with completely absurd ideas that might just on the off chance be true. And so creativity is strange in that manner too, because it's a high risk, high return game. You're a lot safer in your life to find a functioning entity and to operate as a cog within it, as long as the entity keeps functioning. Because if you're creative and you go off on tangents all the time, there's some probability that one of those tangents is going to be exactly what is needed at the time, and you're going to become hyper successful as a consequence. But there's much more probability that even though some of your ideas might be highly valuable, the probability that this is the right time and place for them is extraordinarily low. So to produce a successful creative product, for example, in the marketplace, you need a ridiculous combination of creativity so that you keep generating ideas, and then a network around you of people who have skills that you don't, and then the production of a product, let's say, whatever that happens to be, that's actually in demand by the marketplace at exactly that moment, and that someone else hasn't already done better. So the sensible thing to tell anybody who wants to be creative is, that's stupid. You shouldn't do it. It's your probability of success is so low that it's better just to do something sensible. But the problem with that is that creative people can't do that because they're creative. And if they shut down their creativity, it's like an extrovert who's gone to live in an isolated cell. A creative person who isn't being creative, they just wither and die. So they're stuck with it. But it is a high risk, high return strategy. That the purpose of memory is to provide you with a map of what to do so that you can be secure where you are. And maybe more than that, so that you can be secure and gain advantage, You can get what you need and want from the circumstance. That would be even better. But lots of times you'll just settle for nothing terrible happening. If you can add some additional gain to that, so much the better. Maybe you learn that nothing happens to you in the playground that's upsetting, or maybe you learn that it's a great place to make friends, and that's even better. And then part of exploring the playground would be going out to make friends, and hopefully your mother, in some sense, is somewhat hands-off about that so that you can bang yourself up against the world a bit and learn what you need to learn about how to negotiate friendships. Now, let's go back to this guy who's having murderous fantasies. Now, he's humiliated in high school. So you ask yourself, why? Well, there's a pretty good literature on bullying, and generally, bullies poke at all sorts of people, and they start with little pokes, and if they can get a response that's gratifying to their desire to shame, then they'll keep attacking. But they start off small, and not everybody gets bullied. Most people get bullied some when they're kids, but some people are targeted fairly frequently, and they're people who tend to react in the manner the bully wants. And perhaps there are also people who don't defend themselves very well when the first pokes occur. They don't have a quick word in response. They won't stand up for themselves. They retreat. They get over emotional. So then you might ask yourself, well, why would that be? Well, if your mother is operating properly in the playground, she's there when you run back and you need her. She's not there behind you when you don't need her, making sure nothing bad happens to you. And, well, why? Well, because bad things are going to happen to you, and what you need to learn is how to deal with that on your own. That's the best protection your mother can provide in the final analysis, is to allow you to be challenged, to build competence. And that takes a fair bit of forbearance on her part. Right? She has to be willing to let you go out there and make mistakes. I remember when my daughter was learning, I bought her these monkey bars. Climb up a ladder, cross a ladder, down a ladder. It was pretty high. It was about 8 feet, I think. And she was about 3. She was out in the backyard learning to climb up these monkey bars. It was really interesting to watch her. She'd lift her foot up and lift it up a little higher. lift it up a little higher, and then she'd put her foot on the first rung and put a little weight on it, and then repeat that. Then she'd go up to the first rung, and then she did that with the second rung, like just trial and error, right? A little foray, a little foray, a little foray, mastery, and then a little higher and a little higher. It was a fairly high monkey bar for such a little kid, but we were watching her, and she was doing a good job. We just let her be. And you know, maybe she falls off the monkey bars when she gets to the top and breaks her arm. And then aren't you a terrible parent? And the answer to that is maybe. And maybe not too. You know, because getting that line between protection and overprotection right, that's tough. So now I'll tell you a little story that you all know. So I'm sure most of you have seen the Disney film Sleeping Beauty. And it's a very interesting film, very interesting story. So the way the story sets itself up at the beginning is there's a king and a queen, father and a mother, let's say. And they're older. They haven't had any kids. So they're older parents. And they really want a child because they're older parents and they haven't been able to have any kids. And so finally they have a daughter. They call her Aurora. And they're pretty thrilled about it, and the whole kingdom has a celebration, and it's christening day, and they invite everyone in the kingdom to come, except Maleficent, which is an interesting word because she's an evil queen, but Maleficent means malevolent, right? She's not only that she's Mother Nature, in the negative guise. She's the tragedy of life. That's another way of thinking about it. But she's also malevolent. So she's also betrayal and catastrophe and cruelty. And the king and queen don't invite her to the christening. And you think, well, no wonder. Do you really want something like that at your child's birthday party? Or the christening, let's say? And the answer is, if you don't want that there, then you're that. And that's a hell of a thing to realize. You know, because if you don't allow your child to encounter what's negative about the world in measured doses, and even what's malevolent about the world, then they don't learn how to weave their way around that or to cope with it. Both of those are important. And then they're laid open to it, and then that's on you. And you're doing it because you don't want any of that in your child's life. You don't want any tragedy, you don't want any malevolence, which is why they don't invite her to the evil queen to the wedding. And then what happens later in the story? Well, Maleficent says she's going to either kill Sleeping Beauty, and that's because people who aren't prepared are more likely to die, or it's modified in the story so that she'll only become unconscious. And what does that mean? Well, that's what happens, to people who can't cope with the catastrophe of the world, is that they are tempted by unconsciousness. Maybe they want to sleep all the time, they want to avoid, they're afraid to confront anything. Right? They want to shrink back instead of advancing forward. And to advance forward, in some sense, is to advance forward with full consciousness and courage, and to shrink back is to wish for unconsciousness and maybe even death. And so when Sleeping Beauty hits puberty, she falls in love instantly with some guy she meets in the forest, which is not really something to be recommended. And she falls too hard and too fast for anyone who's sensible, and then finds out that that's a love that's not meant to be, and she's so catastrophically destroyed by that Maleficent is able to entice her into unconsciousness. And so then she's asleep. And she's asleep because the world's too much for her. She wants to be asleep. The rest of this story is about, I think it's Prince Philip, the hero, who confronts Maleficent, who transforms herself into a dragon and attempts to destroy him. and he confronts her successfully and hacks his way through all the thorns that she's put around the castle and wakes Sleeping Beauty up. And you can think about that in a sort of cynical way, that this poor unconscious girl needs the hero who's a man to save her from the catastrophe of nature and malevolence and tragedy. But you can also read it psychologically, and you can say that it's the awakening of the spirit of the hero and the conscious willingness to advance in the face of tragedy and malevolence that's the proper antidote to the desire for unconsciousness in the face of the vicissitudes of life. And you can also read it as a romance, because to some degree, women who have to take care of infants do depend on men to confront the world and protect them. But it's very nicely read as a psychological story as well, and it's accurate. Now, back to the man who wrote me about his fantasies. The parts of his brain that are bringing mind, psyche, that are bringing those memories of being humiliated back are part of an alarm system. It's the same alarm system that tells you when something unexplored is dangerous. And if you're in a social situation, and the consequence of being in this situation is that you're being humiliated and undermined, then obviously you haven't mapped out that situation very well. Now, there might be all sorts of reasons, and some of them might not be your fault, but it doesn't really matter as far as these alarm systems are concerned, because all they're concerned about is the fact that you don't know what to do when you're in that situation, and that's not good for you, and you can't forget it. And the reason you can't forget it is, what if you're in that situation again? And so the alarm system says, well, what if you're in that situation again? What if you're in that situation again? What if you're in that situation again? And often traumatic memories are repetitive for people. They can't get them out of their minds, and then they try to avoid them. And that just makes it worse, because what you tell the alarm system when it rings the alarm, if you try to ignore it, is that the alarm is about something so terrifying that you won't even admit to the fact that there's an alarm. And so that just makes the alarm go off more. And so you try to avoid, and, well, that doesn't work. That's something sort of akin to Freudian repression. And so what I recommended to this gentleman was that he write down all the times he was humiliated. It's like, so you've got these memories that won't let you go, these people who took advantage of you. What happened exactly? That's hard to figure out, right? And maybe now he's a little smarter than he was in high school, because maybe he's 4 years older. It's like, what exactly happened? Because the memory will be emotion laden, but there's a lot of detail around it that's really relevant. And one of the things you can do when you confront a memory like that, which is to confront the terrible things that happened to you in the past, which is the same as confronting terrible things per se, is you can ask yourself, exactly what happened, what part did I play, perhaps, and are there things that I could have done earlier or different, or is there some manner in which I set myself up for this? And so I've had clients who were pretty seriously bullied at work, and we would go into it, and as I said, it starts with a few pushes. And they don't respond, and then the pushes get a little harder, and they don't respond. The pushes get a little harder, and then it turns into something. Well, maybe that's really. I had one client who was bullied into psychosis in high school. She was completely fractured by this person who decided to really do her in a seriously malevolent way, because she wouldn't go on a date with him, and she had no idea that kind of malevolence existed, and so had been badly prepared in some sense to encounter someone like him. Now, if you're allowed to bump up against the rough edges of the world, the natural world and the social world. And if you have someone that you can communicate with, the probability is pretty high that you can learn incrementally how to map the world and your actions in it, so that the probability that you're going to be pathologically prone to catastrophe and betrayal is much reduced. You know, so I'll tell you a story about my mother. So one day I was out playing baseball on a abandoned lot, empty lot near my house, and my wife was there. We were only about 8 or 9, 10, something like that. I was there with some of my friends. One of them was a tough little guy. I was little too, but not as tough. And we were having an argument about something, and we were going to have a fight. And my mother walked by. And my mother's a pretty nice person, you know, and she had to learn late in life, to some degree, to stand up for herself when she went back into the workplace and had to confront some relatively intimidating and pushy men. And it was hard on her to do that, but she was no pushover, my mother, and she's a good person. And she walked by just as this fight was about to emerge. And I was not particularly confident of the probability of my uninjured victory in this fight. But I was a hell of a lot more afraid that my mother was going to come over and interfere. And she didn't. But she knew what was happening. She looked, I saw her look, I knew she knew I knew, and she walked on. And it's like, more power to her, you know. And because I was fortunate to have a mother like that, let's say, I got into enough of the sorts of scrapes that teach you how to avoid a certain amount of scrapes, and that worked out quite nicely. And that's meant my mother was willing to invite malevolence, invite the evil queen into my life, at least to some degree, you know, because she knew better than to assume that that could be just dispensed with. This program that, so this guy that was having these fantasies, he said he's very afraid of the fantasies because they were murderous. And you think murderous fantasies, when do they emerge? Well, they definitely emerge when you've been pushed 100 times and now you're past anything that vaguely resembles reason. And then the fantasy comes up as a manifestation of rage. So I asked him to write down what had happened and also to write down the fantasies. You know, what reaction is it that you're having? Now, you'd hope that it wasn't like he leapt from happy to murderous in one leap. He went through mildly irritated, extremely humiliated, continually humiliated, repeatedly continually humiliated, and then, well, even a few years later, into murderous rage. And the problem with that is that he should have intervened a lot earlier. And so part of what he needed to learn by going back into that memory, which was now associated with those murderous fantasies, is that the aggression that was manifesting itself in the fantasies hadn't been manifested early enough in the process that led to his humiliation. And so then you can imagine, well, why didn't he react to being bullied in a way that would have stopped it? And the answer to that might be, well, he didn't have the skill, he didn't have the physical prowess, or perhaps he was overprotected. I don't know, because I didn't know the story. But it doesn't make any difference, because what he needed to figure out was how to take that response and differentiate it into something that was reasonably skilled, so that the next time someone pulled a stunt that was like the stunts that led to his humiliation in high school, he was ready to act. And so you can think, if a memory that you have that's old, well, or a problem that's bothering you right now that won't let you go, You can look at your fantasies because they'll often give you a clue as to what the appropriate response needs to be, not that that's necessarily the response you have to manifest, and then the trick is to implement the response in a manner that stops you from falling into the same hole that you fell in many times before. These stories that the psychologist's students wrote about their past traumas were curative because if they used words that indicated understanding, comprehension, etc., then they were remapping the territory that they hadn't mapped properly the first time they walked over it. And all of you is very much concerned with your stability and your safety from betrayal and malevolence and the probability, the probability that the necessity to avoid unnecessary tragedy. And so any past behavior that indicates that there's a hole in the map that you're using to orient yourself in the world lets all that terror shine through, and that's what the alarm is. And the reason it goes off is because it's saying to you, you have a map, it's got some bad holes, and the holes are places you probably are going to have to go again. And so if you go there again and the hole's still there, you're going to fall in the hole. And the last time you fell in the hole, it wasn't good for you, and so you should be alert to that. And so that's the reason that memories of that sort won't go away. It's actually a good thing, although it can be very bad if you don't know what to do about it. And it isn't merely a matter of expressing the emotion that's associated with the past catastrophe, because often that not only does that not help, it can actually make it worse, because the mere expression of your frustration, let's say if you were bullied in high school, doesn't stop you perhaps from still being the sort of person that might be bullied by your coworkers. And that's not a positive outcome by any stretch of the imagination. So this program we wrote, it's sort of like psychotherapy for free, essentially. It asks you to, and I used it on this client of mine who'd been bullied into a psychotic state when she was in high school. She could hardly even talk when she first came to see me, and she was hallucinating in all sorts of strange ways. She was really badly fractured by this person who'd tortured her 3/4 to death, and we went through her whole life. She could talk a little bit, and she could write a little bit, and I sat her behind my desk, my computer, and we opened this program. And what it does is it has you divide your life up into epochs, whatever you want. Maybe it's kindergarten, grade 1 to grade 3, grade 3 to grade 6. You know, you can do it numerically like that. You could do it by age. I had people who were more agreeable in temperament. They would divide their life up into relationships. That was really how they conceptualized the stages of their lives. Each relationship, you know, it depends on you. It doesn't really matter, however you conceptualize your life. And then the exercise has you walk through and describe significant events, positive and negative, to lay them out and then to analyze them. It's like, well, what did you do right that enabled the positive events to occur? And what did you do that you might be able to alter, or that you learned to alter later, or that you could alter now, that would help you avoid the negative events? So it's not merely the recounting of the negative, it's, in some sense, it's the extraction of the moral of the story. You know, there's this old idea, I'm sure you've heard me talk about it before, that dragons guard gold. It's a very strange idea, very old idea, treasure of one sort or another, that they threaten the city eternally. That's a dragon. And the city, in some sense, is the citadel of your memory, and the chaos that's outside of the citadel of your memory can always emerge to threaten the citadel, and that's the same story as the Garden of Eden and the snake. It's exactly the same idea. And if you confront the thing that threatens, then you can find the treasure. And you can use that to rebuild the citadel, but also to turn yourself into something that can confront the dragon. And that's the real treasure, right? Is to turn yourself into something that can and is willing to confront the dragon. And so, you know, I did a lot of work with people in my clinical practice on assertiveness therapy and assertiveness training, and these are often for people who are very agreeable and they're more likely to be bullied. And the reason for that is that they don't like conflict, but there's another reason too, which is that they don't have enough faith in the truth and enough fear of the consequences of not telling the truth. And so they'll pretend that things are all right when they're not all right, and then forestall catastrophe for later. And so let's say your boss is kind of a bullying type and pokes at you a bit, takes advantage of you a little bit, and you think, well, that's not really worth making a fuss about, but you go home and you're kind of resentful, but you don't pay any attention to that. Maybe you think you shouldn't be resentful, but probably you don't think that. You just don't want to confront your boss. And the thing is, though, if you do it if it's on the first foray, and you say, you know, here's the reason I won't do that. Well, maybe you'll get fired, but probably not. Not if you're careful. Generally, someone like that will think, oh, you're not as easy to pick on as I thought you were, and they'll go find someone else, or maybe they'll even learn something from the encounter. You know, and that takes a fair bit of courage, and that's part of that confrontation that we just described, you know, is that you're resentful because you've been taken advantage of and you have something to say, and so you need to say it. And when I was doing assertiveness training with my clients, I often talked to them about their resentment. That would be the kind of resentment that might have someone generate murderous fantasies 4 years later. These people who go out and do murderous things, you know, they've harbored an awful lot of resentment. There's a lot of things they didn't say when they should have said them, that's for sure. And so, you know, and if you let the people around you who you love hypothetically take advantage of you, then you're going to harbor resentment, and that's going to come out in all sorts of ways that are really not positive in the least for you or for them. And so it's better just to it's just better to draw the line when when all there is of the dragon is one tooth. Say, no, here's why, leave me alone, or here's how I want to be treated instead. And insist upon that, right? You draw a line. And it's not like that's nothing. And then I suggested to this man with murderous fantasies that he think about what he could have done different in high school, in principle. You know, maybe he needed to get stronger, so he was more confident. I'm not saying this is easy. That's irrelevant. Lots of things aren't easy that end in catastrophe, and the problem was that he was humiliated and now he's murderous, and that's not a good outcome. So even if it's difficult, that doesn't mean it's unwarranted. But even more particularly in a situation like that, you ask, well, how did you allow it to come to such a pass? And what could have you done differently? And maybe you might find that there wasn't anything that you could do differently back when you were in high school, but by the time you're in university, you're not in high school anymore, and the world's shifted quite a bit. And generally, you're around more sophisticated people, and that kind of bullying is less likely. And so you still might have some aggression to integrate within you so that you're not a pushover. And if you do that, well, then those memories, in all likelihood, are going to stop. As long as you're confident that now you know what to do, those memories are very likely to stop plaguing you, and then hopefully those murderous fantasies will go away and you won't be inclined to act them out.